Hi, I'm Adam Meyer with Golden Harvest. I'm here today in a cornfield where I'd like to show you some tactics and techniques on that early season grower visit. So one of the first things we want to do is really establish and set expectations for the year with what we currently have in the field today, and then also make some management recommendations from here on with what we're working with in the field, whether it be good or bad. So one of the first things I like to do is just take an overall plant health assessment and assess the situation all the way across the field. And to begin with, I want to make sure that I walk in well past the headlands to make those first initial looks on things, to make sure that we take away some of those compaction factors and otherwise impactful situations on the end rows. One of the first things I do when I get into the field is establish what our population, our emerged population is there. I like to ask the grower what their intended population was to begin with, so we really know where we were at versus what our target was. And this is important to gauge how well that equipment was working versus what the expectation was. So I like to use a plastic yellow chain that I have at that predetermined 17-foot 5-inch length, which is 1/1000th of an acre for a 30-inch row. So this makes it very easy and handy to go out in the field and go ahead and lay this down and just count. And when I count, I like to count on both rows on each side of it, so then I can start getting a better average with getting a bunch of different stand counts and in multiple rows, so we make sure we're taking that variable out of the equation as well. So here we had a stand that we were trying to establish around that 35,000 mark, and in this row here we do have 35,000 stand, and on this row we have a 34 count. So we were right on target where we were looking for in this particular case, but it's important to take multiple counts across different environments across the field to get that good aggregate population that we were looking for, to know where management can go from here. So the next thing I like to do after understanding what we have for stand and yield potential from that standpoint is go ahead and dig up some plants. And this is very important. I don't go in a field without doing some sort of root digs, because that really tells just as much of the story below the ground as we see above the ground. And the actual digging process is just as important as what we're actually getting out of the ground. Take note when you're putting the tool into the ground how difficult or how much pressure or force you have to put on to get that into the ground, and then specifically if you run into a compaction layer. So that, as we know, can create issues when we get later into the season with root development through that compaction layer. So as I peel away the dirt and evaluate the plant I dug up, you'll notice that our seed is still here and still has some seed treatment on it, signified by the green color in this case. And one of the first things that we would like to do once we take that plant out is to establish what that seeding depth was. So in this case, go ahead and use our seeding depth tool, and when I get to this point where the nodal roots are coming from, this lower part is called the mesocotyl, and I can go ahead and take a measurement from the seed to that top of that mesocotyl where that crown is, and that's right around 1 inch. What I do is go ahead and add 3/4 of an inch to that, and that was my planting depth. So this is very useful in the case that you have a plant that you've seen that is not in the ground and you didn't actually dig up and check that soil line. It's 3/4 of an inch above that crown, or where the mesocotyl ends. So 1 3/4 was absolute perfect. This grower was shooting for 2 inches on the planting depth, and with a little bit of shrinkage with the rain we've had since planting time, this is a very ideal situation as far as the planting depth goes. The next thing we are going to do is just take a look at the plant anatomy here. So the radicle is the first root that came out of the seed and is the longer root that was initially established right away through emergence. Then there's a couple of sets of seminal roots which also come from that seed, and they just help with a little bit of the water uptake and nutrients to a real small degree as we are developing. But the next set of roots are called nodal roots, and they're established here at that first node, and these are the first really important set of roots. So that's where the planting depth is very important, on where these nodal roots are being set and established under that soil surface, and development of these is paramount in switching over from the seed as that nutrient source to our first set of nodal roots will feed that plant. Once we get to, there's a transition period from V3 to that V6 time frame. We kind of have that transition from the seed feeding the plant to the nodal roots feeding that plant. So that's also a very vulnerable time. When we get to that V5, V6 time frame, we are actually setting the number of rows around. So the less amount of stress, or least amount of stress, that we can make these plants go through to that point will be beneficial for setting up this factory for maximum yield potential up until that point. So one of the other things when we're evaluating, we want to look at some healthy and good seedlings of corn, but we also want to look at some of those problem childs and dig those up as well, and maybe identify what was causing the issues on some of those plants. As far as roots go and where you may see some issues, you really want to look at that mesocotyl, and that's the point between the node and the seed there, and make sure it is a nice healthy white color. If we have any browning or what looks like to be diseased, that will be cutting off that nutrient and water supply to the plant, and ultimately leading to potential death with that plant. So that's very important for the overall health, is making sure that the below ground is very intact and healthy as well. The other thing that we want to evaluate on the roots is the root architecture. So if we did not have ideal conditions during planting, and our soil conditions may have been a little bit on the wetter side, you may see some areas that would have had some sidewall compaction and created that V from the planter discs, and that V may have stayed there and actually smeared those sidewalls. If that happened, you'll see what I call a mohawking of the roots, and that's where the roots cannot penetrate outside that V wall, and they will just grow in line with that furrow and are not able to penetrate outside of that. Some of the issues that can create, if we do get to a drier situation, we're getting a little bit past the point now, but you could see some rootless corn if that starts to dry out, and that furrow opens up again, and we get some floppy corn where that root is not able to take hold. You can also see some deficiencies start to take place as that plant is not able to uptake enough nutrients through the root system, as the root system is not established well enough, as well as the uptake of water, which is just as important through that growth cycle. The next thing we'd like to do is stage the corn. So why staging is important is to understand when that corn plant, where that growing point is on that corn plant, which can bring new implications in management as that growing point becomes above the soil surface. So below that first collared leaf, you'll see a sheath that was on there that was the coleoptile, and that was what the leaf tip that helped get that plant through the soil surface, and it had a nice gelatinous tip on it that helped give it some lubrication as it went through the soil surface. The next leaf is a rounded tipped leaf, and that is the true first leaf of the corn plant. After that, you will have alternating leaves, and what you do is feel for that collar, and when you feel that collar underneath of the leaf, that is when it is considered a true leaf. So in this case, we have our first rounded leaf at a V1, we have another collared leaf at a V2, and we have a third collared leaf at a V3. This is a true V3 leaf collared corn plant. So today we are at about in a 320 GDU heat unit range. So it takes about 190 to 110 heat units for us to initiate emergence and get this out of the ground. And then it takes about 80 heat units every leaf thereafter until we get to that V10 type of stage. So with that, we've had, like I said, about 320 heat units, take off about 100 heat units there. That leaves us with about 220, may have taken a little bit less. So that gives us about that V3 stage when you take 3 times 80 and add it to probably 80 gets us in that time frame. And where we're at here, it was actually protected and probably warmed a little bit quicker. We have nice black soil as this was worked soybean ground, and so things probably came out of the ground a little bit quicker here than in some other circumstances. One of the other things that we want to evaluate when we're out in the cornfield is the overall health. And you know, are there some plants that don't look as healthy as others? So if we have some plants that on the headlands or in some lower ground that have some purpling on the edges or the margins, that may be a sign of phosphorus deficiency, and that can be an actual soil fertility problem, but a lot of times it's more of a root limiting problem, not allowing to take up that phosphorus early in the season, or the availability of that phosphorus early in the season. One of those remedies can be using a pop-up type of fertilizer that has some phosphorus or heavier in the phosphorus to make sure that we have that phosphorus available early in the season, especially if we're in a no-till type of environment, heavy residue, some place that the soils may be cooler to begin with and would benefit from that type of an application. There are some genetic tendencies with purpling of corn as well, that some corns may show that color even without a deficiency more than some other genetics as well. One of the other big early season deficiencies that we see, especially when we get to that time frame when we are switching over from the seminal roots and that seed feeding the plant to the nodal roots feeding the plant, is sulfur. And with sulfur, you'll see an overall yellowing on the tops of the plants to interveinal yellowing, where the veins will stay nice and green, and in between those veins will turn yellow to even bright yellow in some cases where it's very severe, where that vein versus the inner vein is very stark and noticeable. So sulfur is one of those things that needs to be treated similar to nitrogen. It is a leachable nutrient, and we do need it there for enzymatic activities. So it's important even early, especially earlier in the plant development, as all those cells divide and we need that enzyme activity. So sulfur will really show up in places where there's lower organic matter, or we've had a lot of drainage, your coarser soil types. You're definitely going to see that sulfur have run through that profile or not be as prevalent in those types of situations. We saw it last year a little bit more than this year, where we had that real cool, wet soil to begin with. The release of sulfur is a biological activity, a microbial activity, so we really need moisture and heat to have that process to allow free release of that sulfur for uptake from our corn plants, especially earlier in the season. So the addition of sulfur is very important, especially as a front-loaded type of a program, and to make sure we have that on the early side. Potassium, we don't see a lot of deficiencies earlier in the season with potassium, but if we do, that's going to be some yellowing on the leaf margins to a browning on the tip to even browning on the leaf margins as well. But like I said, potassium is more of a nutrient we normally attribute to issues later in the season as opposed to earlier in the season. One of the other common misconceptions is a zinc deficiency, which can be misconstrued with a sulfur deficiency, and a lot of times that zinc, manganese, magnesium, they can look very similar when we're trying to diagnose some of those earlier season type of issues as far as fertility goes. As we're scouting the field, it is worth noting not just what the crop looks like and how healthy it is. Also note, are there weeds present and how healthy are they? This was one of those years that there were certain geographies and conditions that did not activate some of those pre-chemistries, and so we had some weeds emerge through that chemistry before they were activated, as well as some other growers trying to cut expenses, didn't use that pre and were planning on that full post program, and now some of the fields might be getting fairly hairy. So just taking note of what species are out there. Are they broadleafs or grasses, and what kind of size are we at, to help frame up what a good timing for that herbicide application would be, is also beneficial on that grower visit. One of the last things that we want to evaluate is insect damage. So as we're scouting the field, we really want to look for shot holing or feeding on the leaves, and that will indicate that there has been some sort of insect feeding on that plant. And we're really getting into the time frame where black cutworms will be out, and that larva will be feeding on plants. So we're at a very vulnerable stage if we're at that V4 to V5 type of stage. And what black cutworms do is cut that plant off at the soil line or just below the soil line. And if we're at that V4, V5 type of stage, then that growing point is becoming above the soil surface, and when we cut off that plant will die. So we'll be thinning stand, or the insect will be thinning the stand every plant that they cut off. So this is a very vulnerable time frame as far as that goes. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot we can do except watch that stand go away. Rescue treatments are not the best at this point, and especially when those black cutworms live below the soil surface, it's hard to try to affect them effectively with an insecticide application. That's where Agrosure Viptera comes into play as a very valuable tool in our toolbox around the outsides of the fields, as well as those fields that might be more vulnerable to armyworms or black cutworms, those fields that have a cover crop, heavy residue fields, no-till environments. Those would be ones that I would definitely target my plan to have Agrosure Viptera containing product to help mitigate those issues. With that, thank you for joining me for our corn crop scouting episode here, and I look forward to seeing you all this summer. Thank you.